transport issues. Guess I should have taken an Uber or something like that. Okay, what is my talk actually called? Does anybody know? This is it.
I know.
What is it?
It's the financial.
The financial, good. I can do that.
Social and economic structures influence the art world.
Oh, okay. I knew it was about that, but it's actually called that. Okay, I can do that. I looked at the description only last night, and this is the first time that not only did I not write the description of the essay, I didn't even read it. So it leaves me in a bit of a... But I guess I have strong opinions on these issues. So let me enunciate some of them. Whenever I think about the relationship of finance and art, I always think of an old friend of mine named Chris Kakamis. He was a sculptor, and he's a sculptor who largely works in paper. He does these very elaborate and beautiful sort of poppy images made out of folded and glued paper. And Chris at one point was broke. Actually, many points Chris was broke. Chris is usually broke. But once he was very broke, and he decided that he was going to make a sculpture which completely consisted of the words, "I need money." So he wrote the words, "I need money," made them out of paper, painted each letter in a different primary color, and took it down to the gallery. And he said nothing he's ever done sold so fast. It just was instantly snapped up. He got $6,000 or $7,000. He was incredibly happy. And then a few months later, whoever bought it, I don't remember who that was, sold that sculpture to the Museum of Contemporary Art in New York, who liked it so much they put it on their tote bags that they sold in the shop downstairs. So now all over New York, there's people wandering around with little bags that say, "I need money," in bright primary colors, and he isn't getting a penny for any of that. So it's a beautiful illustration of a basic principle of the relation of art and finance, which is who's scamming who, which is kind of something everybody's always trying to figure out, because art in its contemporary form largely consists of a series of arguments about what art is, and the matter is ultimately often decided by money. It's a really interesting thing also that I've observed on many occasions, that artistic neighborhoods, sort of bohemian neighborhoods, have tended to accumulate around financial districts in major cities. There is a kind of intrinsic relationship between artistic avant-gardes and finance capital, or there has come to be. I don't think there always was. And I was kind of always trying to figure out why that was and what that relationship was. To some degree, I think it's based on the fact that both of them are kind of phony versions of something. The financiers are essentially phony capitalists. They're capitalists that don't actually make anything, and the Bohemians are increasingly sort of phony proletarians. They're actually working with their hands. They know how to use acetylene torches and play around with industrial solvents, and they get their hands dirty in the most literal of ways, and they make stuff. But they are, for the most part, not a simulation of a working class, which is the perfect complement to the financial simulation of the capitalist class. And so it makes sense that both of them kind of think of themselves as putting something over on the other. Especially, and you could think that 1% of the 1% who are the art collectors of the world are the ultimate. They see their ability to turn random objects into art, or what might otherwise seem like random objects into art, that they sit on top of this gigantic institutional apparatus which resolves the question of what is art in any, which is, as I say, is the entire discipline of art is basically an argument about this. They ultimately cast the deciding vote by buying stuff. So it's a way that, especially since those institutions ultimately, are rooted in museums, which are kind of this secular equivalent of places of worship, they become their money becomes a kind of sacral grace, which baptizes ordinary objects from their perspective magically and turning them into something of higher value, and ultimately validates the value of this very abstract finance capital, which no one's quite sure what it is and whether it even really exists. Of course it does. I mean, what finance really is other people's debts, but we don't need to go into that. The question I've talked about this a little in the past. The interesting question might be, how did we come to this, and what are the larger political implications? One thing I've always been fascinated with is the way art functions as what a linguist would call marked and an unmarked term. That the marked and unmarked terms are words that operate on two different levels of abstraction, sort of the way you might say animal, vegetable, and mineral. So vegetable stands for all, is both. There's an opposition between a vegetable and a fruit, right? But both of them are vegetables when you compare them to animals and minerals. So if you take that kind of linguistic logic where one of a category represents the others, it's always the physical objects, art as sculpture, painting, drawing. And when people say art, they assume they mean physical objects of art, even though the arts actually includes everything from opera to origami, I guess. Poetry included. So why is it when we say art, we're always thinking of a thing? There's various people who have come up with hypotheses about this, but the most interesting that I've seen are by Alain Caillet, the French founder of the famous MOS group, and Boris Groys, who Caillet makes the point that the idea of the artist as hero really emerges from the Industrial Revolution. It's exactly the moment when you have mass production of objects that are all the same, where you know absolutely nothing about the people who made them, and it doesn't matter at all, that you have another category of object emerges where you know, in theory, everything about the person who made it, and who that person is makes all the difference in the world. In fact, the only thing that really matters to establishing its value. So it's as if the old ideal of a craftsman splits in two and takes off in schismogenetic, opposite directions. So at the same time, you have the notion of the artistic vanguard and the political vanguard basically emerge at exactly the same time. It's the same idea. There was a debate between Saint-Simon and Comte in the wake of the French Revolution about who would be the sort of replace the priesthood as the socially integrated ideological force of the new industrial society or new revolutionary society, depending on whether you're doing a left or a right version of the same thing. And the question is whether it would be scientists, which was Auguste Comte's idea, or whether it would be artists, which was Saint-Simon's. But in either case, they were seen as a vanguard. And playing a very, very similar role. And in fact, socially, there was always a remarkable overlap between who was actually in sort of artistic bohemian circles and who was in revolutionary circles. Pierre Bourdieu did some fascinating research on who actually went to bohemian shows in the 19th century. And surprisingly, it wasn't actually who you think it was. There's a stereotype that they are all the kind of down and out rebellious children of the bourgeoisie who are then going to living off their parents' money, who are eventually going to go off and get jobs in the family firm. And maybe about a third of them were. But a lot of them were actually children of peasants, because this is the first generation where there was universal education after 1848. And essentially, you had a first generation of people who, came from very modest backgrounds, got a bourgeois education, and then suddenly discovered that just having a bourgeois education didn't mean you actually got to be part of the bourgeoisie. So they were pissed off, and they had the whole entire history of social theory to back up their pissed offedness. And this is really that sort of meeting place, the downwardly mobile children of the bourgeoisie, professional classes, the upwardly frustrated children of the popular classes, becomes a basis both for revolutionary, think of Chairman Mao, the school librarian, Children of Peasants, and Zhou Enlai, or Che meets Fidel. That's the basis of both revolutionary alliances and artistic bohemian circles ever since. Now, all of that tradition sort of explodes. As revolutionary coalitions, it still somewhat exists, really does explode and is destroyed after World War I. And World War I is the first occasion I know of where you see this very interesting sociological phenomena. People haven't really talked about it that much as such, but I think it's very important. I call it flame out. The idea of flame out is that there are, at certain moments of global revolution, you have a moment where some genre of expressive cultural activity kind of goes mad and runs through every logical radical possibility, formal logical form, where formal radicalism and political radicalism can be the same thing. It kind of runs them all out within a matter of 3 or 4 years. If you think about it, in 1917, that happened with the tradition of avant-garde art. You have Dada, you have Bohemianism. They're just doing everything you could possibly imagine that's crazy and subversive. You know, they'll have shows where the only way to get in is to crawl through the toilet in the men's room in a bar, and they put on plays where they make the audience go insane and throw things at them, and have little ducks catching the raw vegetables that are thrown at them, and every kind of formal thing you can do, and they kind of run through all the gestures. And this is one reason why 100 years later, you read about radical art, they still always go on and on about Dada and Surrealists, because they kind of did it all and they didn't leave anybody else any formal radical gestures to do. And if you think about it, in 1968, the exact same thing happens again, a world revolutionary moment, with the tradition of continental philosophy. Essentially, everybody goes mad, and within about 5 or 6 years, they say every radical thing you can say, which is both formally radical and conceptually radical and politically radical at the same time. So suddenly everybody's saying, yes, truth is a form of violence, man does not exist. And they just sort of say every radical thing you can think of, and then the rest of us are left with, now, what do we do now? Right? So once again, just like we're always constantly referring back to art of that period of 1917 through the 20s, we still constantly recycling French theory from basically 1968 to maybe 83, when they sort of run through all the logical possibilities. So after that, it's true. I always say it's incredibly frustrating, because it's as if why are all these people think they're so cool and they're reading this stuff from French theory from the 70s? It's like they're still listening to classic rock and think they're hip. It's like the same period as Led Zeppelin and Fleetwood Mac, except they're just endlessly going on about Deleuze as if he's blown away everything. Almost 50 years ago now. Okay, so why do we have these periods, and what do we do afterwards? I think that in the case of contemporary art, essentially you're in a situation where all the ways you can be formally radical and politically radical at the same time get exhausted within a couple of years, and they're left with relatively few political possibilities. One is, of course, to simply be formally radical and not be politically radical. If you're Andy Warhol or Jackson Pollock, and a lot of people did that. Another one is to be politically radical and not be formally radical. If you're, say, Diego Rivera, or a lot of political art. It doesn't necessarily breaking conceptual barriers. It's good art and it's radical. Or you can be formally radical and politically radical and not do art, which is what the Situationists and people like that do. But those are essentially the three things you can do. There was an attempt to rethink the spiritual basis of the whole apparatus. Joseph Bollmay's might be seen as embodying that possibility, but really in the battle that people describe between Boys and Warhol for the direction of art, Warhol won, as we all know. So this is as far as I had gotten thinking about this, but the more I kind of integrate that idea of how we got to the situation where we're in now, where we have the financial classes and our artists essentially both thinking they're scamming the other, it's kind of with this kind of baptism of money. I think that we need to think about the sort of key figures from the very end of that first period of artistic flameout. The last of the Dadaists, Marcel Duchamp, who introduced essentially the notion of managerialism into art, that like selecting things with the famous fountain is itself an artistic gesture. And that validation of managerial labor has become more and more come to define what art is. And that corresponds, I think, with I could trace a direct line from that to Warhol to, I don't know, Jeff Koons or something like that, where the salesman, the manager, the sort of American tradition of the guy who just through his own gift of gab and bunkum sort of turned something into marketable commodities, has come to increasingly dominate what art has become. And what strikes me is this is appropriate considering the new forms of class alignment that have happened within capitalism over the course of the post-war years. Now, what has happened, especially since the 70s, but it's already starting to happen, is that, like, the traditional collectors were genuine capitalists, Frick, Rockefeller, Carnegie, all those people, filled their houses with contemporary avant-garde art. And increasingly, as time goes on, the nature of the capitalist classes shifts away from the industrial, old-fashioned robber barons to finance capital, which is itself increasingly bureaucratized. So the upper echelons of the sort of bureaucrat executives, basically corporate bureaucrats, running large firms, kind of fuse together with the financial speculators who then become bureaucratized themselves and hedge funds, venture capital of one form or another. And before you know it, there's a sort of new financialized capitalist class, which then forms a new political alliance. And this is very critical, because it's the same period where what had been left-wing political parties who formed, who relied on the proletariat for at least a large part of their political base, increasingly turned away, and very self-consciously in many cases, it can be documented, turned away from the proletariat to the professional managerial classes. The Democratic Party under Clinton is all very explicit, and Tom Frank has written about this. He actually found smoking gun documents where the Democrats say, why do we need the unions anyway? Why do we need this working class base? We can go to the people, we don't have to rely on the nurses in the hospital. We can help with the people managing the hospitals. We don't need to rely on the teachers. We can rely on the people, the school administrators. The professionals became the new sort of base of support for what formerly left-wing parties. And at that same time, you find phenomena happening within the art world where the new financialized elites who go on art spending binges actually themselves are increasingly reliant on a managerial conception of art. And first of all, it's happening on the ground. I mean, more and more people I know who go to art school say you don't even learn how to use a blowtorch and all that stuff that you used to do. If you do, it's like this kind of cheap thrill because increasingly artists get other people to actually do it. So they're in the situation of designers and managers themselves. But even more, of course, as we all know, you have curation as being more and more important. And that importance of curation corresponds with something that's happening in all creative industries. It's a phenomena that I have labeled bullshitization. So it's there's not only creation of endless new types of bullshit industries, you have within existing industries endless accretion of levels. I call it managerial feudalism as well. These endless intermediaries that are placed between the guys with the money and the people who are actually making or doing something. You see it in journalism. Suddenly there are producers in addition to just editors and writers. You see it in Hollywood. Oh my God, there's like 7 of them now. Script writers say, if you want to know why movies suck, I mean, this is the reason there's 18 different people interviewing in the script. Because there's all these, I'm the executive vice president for vision management or something like that. And, I have nothing to do. I have no excuse really for my existence. So I have to come up with one by sort of interfering on every level of the creative process. But increasingly those guys who had at first just been kind of interfering in the creative process decide they're the creative geniuses. And you see this above all in the art world where curators are large in the same way that critics in the early part of the century seem to be effacing the artist. Now the curators are guys like Adam Chimchik does famous marginal art exams, there's a lot of people think is the apotheosis of this. And Documenta a couple years ago, where he simply just took folk art, primitive art objects, 60s record sleeves, and to sort of mix them together with things by recognized artists. So just basically a way of aggressively saying, look, I'm the guy who creates value here. So the managerial classes, in the same way as they've appropriated from the proletariat that role of being the official allies of the financial elites, political allies, managerialism has taken over in every level of physical art as well. I want to think about then poetry in this regard, because this is a poetry festival. And what I think is interesting and significant about the relation of poetry and finance, I wanted to say that poetry is like a hot bath that renders you infertile, but at least you can't sell it. They mean something very specific by this. I had a friend who told me once about the history of contraception. Early part of the 20th century, when they were doing the initial research on contraceptive techniques, one of the things that the early feminists discovered was one of the most promising things, ways of preventing childbirth, was that if a man takes a very hot bath for over 15 minutes, he's very unlikely to fertilize anybody for the next 12 hours. And this has excited people for a while, but the research was never completed, and we don't really know in detail how to do this. And the reason why is they realized there's no way you can sell this to anybody. Like a condom, IUD, all these things, there's something you can market, a pill, but you can't really sell somebody a hot bath. Either you have a bathtub or you don't. As a result, we don't know about this. And I think poetry has a status a little bit like that. Poetry is something that you can't really market. And as a result, my friend Sophie Carapetti always points this out. If you compare the art community and the poetry community in London, for example, poets are very cooperative. They're constantly doing projects together and being mutually supportive in all sorts of ways that artists, there are obvious exceptions. Artists in general tend to be much more individualistic and suspicious of each other. In art, there is a prize you could win, And in poetry, you're never going to get rich from doing poetry. Everybody knows that it doesn't even really enter the picture. So there's something kind of wonderful about that. It creates a different social relations because finance just can't get its teeth into poetry and never will. It also evokes emotions that are very different, I think, than the more material arts. Notably, I think hatred. I think the importance of hatred as an emotion, as a creative emotion, is very often vastly underrated. I think hatred is perhaps the quintessential political emotion, but in a way, it's the foundation, I've always felt, for any legitimate idea of love. All love is founded on hatred of some kind, but it's very interesting. You never hear people talk about hating art, do you? People are indifferent to art, they're annoyed by art, they try to ignore it, they find it confusing, they might, find it irritating that some people worship it, or they might worship it themselves, but they tend not to hate it. But lots of people hate poetry, and it seems to be part of the nature of poetry. I actually had this book, and this talk gave me an excuse to read some of it that I bought just for the title. It's called The Hatred of Poetry. It had a passage I thought was very moving. It said, every few years an essay appears in a mainstream periodical denouncing poetry or proclaiming its death, usually blaming existing poets for the relative marginalization of the art. And then the offenses light up on the blogosphere before the culture. If we can call it a culture, turns its attention. If we can call it attention. Back to the Future. Why don't we ask, what kind of art is defined, has been defined for millennium by such a rhythm of denunciation and defense? Many more people agree they hate poetry than can agree what poetry is. I too dislike it, and have largely organized my life around it. So I think this is very interesting, that the poetry, it strikes me, because it can't really be commoditized, it won't, and nobody really imagines that it could be, is essentially, in its nature, a weapon. Boris Groys argued that art, and of course he meant physical art, material art, is the auto-critique of the commodity. It is a commodity that critiques itself, or at least asks what is art, what is a commodity. It does so by various types of irony and play, but it doesn't really do it by anger and hatred very much. Whereas poetry is essentially a weapon. They use, famously, one of my first images of poetry that I really liked was, I once read that Irish poets used to be able to rhyme rats to death. That really impressed me. So it's something essential to the nature of poetry, that it is toxic in a really good way. So I would suggest here that that's what we should do in this place, that we should unleash that sort of venomous power of poetry on the very financial powers that cannot contain.